Stellan Skarsgård gained critical acclaim for his portrayal of Boris Yevdokimovich Shcherbina in the 2019 HBO TV series. A tough and imposing man, very self-confident and moulded by the Communist Party. But the show doesn't touch on the backstory that turned him into such a person, nor focuses on the specifics of how he worked in the liquidation. So let's explore that today. From humble beginnings, Boris Yevdokimovich Shcherbina's life began in the village of Debaltsevo on October 5, 1919. His father was a railroad worker, a working class position where they were fortunate enough to own a house, but had little opportunity for much more in life. But now the communist revolution had arrived, and Shcherbina's opportunities had expanded. It was fortunate for young Boris and his siblings that these high opportunities had arisen. They were all sharp-minded and quick learners, allowing them to earn high grades in their curriculum. When Shcherbina had finished his school education in 1937, he ultimately decided not to follow in his older brother's footsteps in studying military affairs, instead rolling in the Kharkiv's Institute of Rail Transport Engineers, following in his father's footsteps. In 1939, Boris surpassed his father's status by joining the Communist Party as a member of the Communist Youth League, also known as the Komsomol, something their parent couldn't do due to a conviction for a violation of worker discipline. It was at the institute in January of 1940 where Shcherbina disappeared from his education without informing any of his friends or teachers of his whereabouts, leaving them to wonder what had happened to the young, intelligent engineer they knew so well. And when he returned in March, few asked where he had been, and the few that did would be met with no answer. Shcherbina had in fact participated in the Winter War against Finland, serving his country as a member of the 316th Ski Squadron, a group composed entirely of Komsomol volunteers that were trained under close supervision by the NKVD, and then deployed to the front line until the end of the conflict. In 1942, as his education at the institute ended, he received his first major promotion, the Komsomol's secretary for the Kharkiv Regional Committee. But Shcherbina was not in Kharkiv to finish his education. He was in Tashkent of Uzbekistan, evacuated when the Germans occupied the region during the Patriotic War. However, Boris's military experience made him an excellent candidate to join the Komsomol in assisting in the evacuation of towns close to the front line, and on November 26, 1942, he was deployed to Stalingrad. The battle raged on. Shcherbina helped to remove the sheltering civilians from the basements of liberated buildings mere hundreds of meters away from the Germans. Every family had at least one dead body with them. Medical aid had to be carried out on the wounded as artillery pounded the ruins day and night. It wasn't until days after the battle drew to a close, on February 8, 1943, that Shcherbina finally left what was once a major city. By the end of the year, Shcherbina had returned to Kharkiv, continuing to serve as secretary for the Komsomol in the region, assisting in the rebuilding efforts where possible. 3 long years of conflict had shaped Shcherbina's character, but it had also captured the attention of the Communist Party. By 1945, Shcherbina was enrolled in the party school under the Central Committee of the Ukrainian Communist Party, graduating in 1948. Shcherbina was already making his mark, rising from second secretary of the Industrial Army District of Kharkiv to the secretary and second secretary of the Irkutsk Regional Committee of the Communist Party by 1961. From here, Shcherbina was transferred to the secretary of the massive Tyumen region of Western Siberia. Many have found this a difficult job, but it was something that Shcherbina, whose intelligent mind had been moulded by years of combat experience on the front line, blossomed in. From here, Shcherbina launched an incredible plan to develop the production of oil and gas in the region. The logistical challenge of this required expertise from across the USSR and the Eastern Bloc to partake in the construction of a network of pipes to transport these newfound resources through the permafrost to the western oblasts, where it could be processed. Multiple air bases were built to assist in the transport of materials, and the economics of the region began to dramatically improve. This work continued even as he left Tyumen in 1973, promoted to the Central Committee as the Minister of Construction of Oil and Gas Industry. Over the next 10 years, Shcherbina more than doubled the amount of pipework laid and dramatically increased the amount of oil and gas flowing through them. Automation of the systems became a priority, as well as the overcoming of the technological channels that had plagued him for decades. Public recognition of Shcherbina's work came a decade later, on October 6, 1983, the day after his 64th birthday. He was awarded the title of Hero of Socialist Labour and awarded the Order of Lenin. A year later, Shcherbina fully left the oil and gas industry to become the deputy chairman of the Council of Ministers, serving beneath Nikolai Tikhonov and Nikolai Ryzhkov, a more senior position, yet far more varied, having to complete errands across the USSR. By far, Shcherbina's most important strength was his ability to seek the support of others, not relying on his own intelligence or self-believed knowledge, allowing him to understand all complexities of a problem and to determine the best possible solution in a short period of time. On April 26, 1986, Shcherbina was not in Moscow as usual, but in Orenburg, in the Kazakh Soviet Socialist Republic, planned to become an energy hub. While Shcherbina sat in the room, presiding and preparing to give a speech at the end of the meeting he was attending, his assistant sat in a room behind a curtain, with a telephone linked to Moscow. And as we all know, he received a call from Nikolai Ryzhkov, the Soviet Prime Minister, asking for Shcherbina. A note was passed along, and the meeting was paused for the phone call. In a reversal of the HBO scene, it was Shcherbina who was called and told about the accident, a government commission being formed, and that he was on it, or rather, leading it. Shcherbina initially refused the role, but when Ryzhkov insisted, he accepted. He gave his speech at the meeting, and then took his plane to Moscow. After a lunch break, Legasov and the other members of the third part of the government commission to head to Chernobyl departed from Moscow to Kiev alongside him, and it was at this time that Shcherbina, much more politely than in a dramatization, asked Legasov how a nuclear reactor worked. Legasov gave a brief but detailed description of the RBMK, and explained a 3-mile island accident, where the panic caused more damage than the radiation. It was this fact that Shcherbina took to Pripyat, having landed in Kiev and escorted north in a series of black limousines. When he arrived, however, this idea of a no-panic scenario fell apart quickly. As the meeting proceeded, and one by one, people told him the situation was far worse than they expected. Only the health officials did not recommend an immediate evacuation, as the radiation levels were currently too low. But if they changed, then it would be too late. After a short amount of deliberation, Shcherbina authorized the evacuation of Pripyat, and then turned to demanding helicopters from Ryzhkov. By phone. Major General Nikolai Antoshkin and a small sortie of helicopters were deployed to Pripyat. It was close to midnight when Antoshkin arrived, and he quickly went to Shcherbina. "You and your helicopter pilots, General," Shcherbina said, "are our only help right now. The crater must be sealed tightly with sand, from above. There is no other way to approach the reactor, only from above. Only your helicopter pilots." "When shall we start?" Antoshkin asked. "When shall we start? Right now, immediately." "We can't, Boris Yevdokimovich. We haven't brought our helicopters yet. We need to find a landing site, a place to control them. We could at dawn." "Then start at dawn," Shcherbina ordered. "Take matters into your own hands." By April 27th, Pripyat had been evacuated, and it was decided the helicopters would take off and land on the main square of the city of Pripyat, ordering and demanding hurried filling of the 60-kilogram sandbags that were loaded on the helicopters and flown to the nuclear power plant. When he found out that they'd only dropped 80 tons in a day, Shcherbina grew angry, claiming they needed to up this. His plan? Draft the local villages and towns to help fill up the sandbags. With further experimentation and work, they were able to deliver up to 1,000 tons of material in a single day by April 30th, and Shcherbina smiled for the first time since he arrived in Chernobyl. 1,200 tons were now dropped on May 1st. The next day, Shcherbina was relieved of duty and replaced by Ivan Sileyev. Back in Moscow 2 days later, Shcherbina and his colleagues, exhausted, had to undergo examination for their radiation exposure. Clothes were surrendered, foreign watches buried, and their heads were shaved. Except for Shcherbina, of course, who declared that treatment beneath the dignity of a member of the USSR Council of Ministers. He settled for a trim. In Moscow, Shcherbina would still not get a break from Chernobyl, delivering meetings with the Politburo, discussing the technical obstacles that would await the cleanup, from water to mining under the reactor. Helping where he could in the exclusion zone, Shcherbina organised the construction of Cape Verde, a temporary town for the liquidators, deploying some builders he personally knew from Siberia to equip the site as efficiently as possible. While in Moscow, he researched the causes of the accident, and in July, he gave his opinion during a Communist Party meeting, as part of his report on the accident. The accident became possible in the first place due to serious problems in the work of the operational personnel of the station, because of the state of carelessness that had been created there. All attention was focused on the production of electrical power. The leadership of the station, the conglomerate Soyuz Atomenergo, and the Ministry of Energy did not draw appropriate lessons from the accidents and equipment failures that happened earlier, and did not take necessary measures. One could say that they got away with everything. Here, as never before, mistaken confidence in the absolute safety of the nuclear power stations, of its use as a standard for the entire industry, has developed into a dangerous conviction. The main responsibility for the accident lies with the leadership of the station, the Soyuz Atomenergo conglomerate, and the Ministry of Energy and Electrification. In 20 years of operating nuclear power stations, the ministry must have accumulated experience, prepared the personnel, and organised order and discipline. And later, he says this. Speaking about the responsibility of the Ministry of Energy and Electrification, one has to note that Deputy Minister Shcherbina, who is in charge of nuclear stations, and head of the conglomerate, Verotnikov, did not solve the core issues of ensuring safe operation of nuclear plants. These issues did not receive appropriate attention. Since 1983, the Collegium of the Ministry never once discussed issues related to safety of nuclear power plants. Even at the Commission meetings, Yemelyanov was trying to avoid responsibility for the flaws of the reactor. He proposed his own theory of the causes of the accident linked to a failure of the circulation pump or a rupture of the circulation pipeline. As has been established by now, all the pumps remain in their proper place. Shcherbina continues on a tirade against the management of the nuclear power plant, yet is complicit in allocating the blame to the personnel instead, covering up the true causes of the accident. A behaviour necessary to save face for the Soviet party he held so dearly. In September, now done finalising reports and assisting with the Vienna conference in part, Shcherbina was now back in Chernobyl and in charge of directing management of the accident from the town at the southern tip of the cooling pond. Here, we will take a listen to a story from Nikolai Karpan, the Deputy Chief Engineer of the Safety Department, who had wound up filling in for the director of the Chernobyl MPP, who was unable to attend the meeting. The meeting starts with an air of tension, and when it is Karpan's turn to speak, as he hangs up charts to present, Shcherbina begins yelling at him. Why doesn't the MPP director report? I want to see the director and hear him reporting on the deadlines missed. Legasov tried to calm the situation down. According to the session agenda, today, the keynote report will be presented by the Deputy Chief Engineer Karpan. We have to decide on human resources. Shcherbina let him start, but Karpan didn't get very far. When will Cape Verde townsite be fenced by a normal fence? When will your director come in person to the commission sessions instead of sending his deputies? When will you finally install the computer to process radiation monitoring results? Well, Karpan didn't know about the fence or his director's illness, but he did know that the computer system was ready to go. Then, Shcherbina's assistant lied and said the report wasn't filed duly. Legasov now tried to calm the situation down even more. Boris Yevdokimovich, these issues are really outside his sphere of competence. But Karpan instead lost control of his mouth and blurted out, "The computer request form was compiled duly, and we discussed the supply with the manufacturer preliminary. There are no problems between us and the plant. I can prove it. As for the fence, it is the construction workers' responsibility, not ours." Shcherbina lost his temper, cursed Karpan under every insult possible, and then said, "For edification of other managers, I dismiss you from your job. This dismissal is effective from this day." Karpan thanked Shcherbina for his unexpected break from work and left the room, which was now in stunned silence. A couple hours later, Karpan had a one-to-one meeting with Shcherbina, where they joked and Shcherbina signed off on a classified document. Karpan found the humour in being temporarily fired and then rehired because someone else didn't build a fence. Between 1986 and 1989, Shcherbina spent 92 days in the exclusion zone and was heavily motivated in continuing to work there, even as his health subtly started to deteriorate from the prolonged radiation exposure. In and out of hospital, he still tried to keep up with tasks. But other events also occurred. On December 7, 1988, an earthquake struck Armenia, hitting Spitak close to the epicenter. A huge disaster that even today has seen the population of some settlements, such as Leninakan, cut in half. Shcherbina, on official business in Armenia at the time, was one of the first officials on scene, alongside the General Secretary of the Armenian Soviet Socialist Republic, Suren Harutyunyan. Surveying the damage from a helicopter, Shcherbina reported his findings to the government and was quickly placed as their representative. While there, Shcherbina showed the best and worst of himself. On the spot, he could organise the necessary logistics for an airlift of vital construction and rescue equipment that would help save lives. On the other hand, he developed a persistent cough, began to drink heavily, living in a trailer and wearing the same hat and sheepskin jacket until he was relieved in January of 1989 and sent to a hospital. His lightly coloured clothes were never washed, nor he, and when his family saw him almost black with dirt, they couldn't believe their eyes. When he heard that Gorbachev was going to visit the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in February, he insisted on being there, despite his poor health and doctors recommending he not fly, and instead remain at a hospital for treatment. Still, he decided to travel anyway. Now, Gorbachev, of course, did not stay for very long, dogged by civilians, and after a quick walk through the power units, they went to Slavutich, and even then avoided crowds there. After a quick photo shoot, they got back in cars and drove to Chernigov airport, and boarded a plane back to Moscow. Despite it being illegal at the time, a bottle of cognac brandy appeared as a celebration for Soviet Army Day. No sooner had Shcherbina put down the glass, he went white as a sheet, and if it wasn't for the quick thinking of the doctor Yuri Israel, also on the trip, who unbuttoned his shirt and put an oxygen mask on Shcherbina, he would have died on that flight back to Moscow. It quickly became apparent Shcherbina had had a heart attack, and when the plane landed, he was rushed back to hospital. But still, Shcherbina remained desperate to continue to work for the government, albeit not for much longer. Gorbachev announced on April 25, 1989, that he had decided on pursuing a cleansing of the Communist Party Central Committee, eliminating many people who had been elected to their positions and replacing them with unelected ones supported by himself. Not through killings, of course, but voluntary retirement. Many spoke out against this in private, including Shcherbina, but only one person, Efim Slavsky, dared say it to Gorbachev himself. The next day, the third anniversary of the Chernobyl disaster, the Soviet government held their final meeting before this purge, to discuss the declining economic health of the USSR. On June 7, 1989, Shcherbina was forced into voluntary retirement. His work was now greatly reduced in capacity. And then Yeltsin was elected the Supreme Soviet of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic in May of 1990. The firm communist inside of Shcherbina, who saw the Politburo as an absolute necessity to the nation, wrote his own protest, demanding that the Politburo do something, anything, to stop them. But the Politburo was now powerless, and it would mean nothing. A day after writing the letter, Shcherbina fell ill. He was quickly taken in critical condition to Granovsky Street Hospital, fading in and out of consciousness. But his willpower allowed him to recover at least slightly, and he returned to work while still in hospital, assisting in the logistics of Siberian gas lines. But as the Politburo's strength declined, so did Shcherbina's health, and on August 22, 1990, Shcherbina passed away. He was buried with full military honours in the Novodevichy cemetery on a rainy day. Almost a year to the day after his death, the Soviet government he held so dearly would disintegrate in a coup. Shcherbina is immortalised in his works, be it the transformation of the Siberian gas lines, the work to mitigate the damage of the Chernobyl disaster, or rebuilding after the Armenian earthquake, but his life was dark and filled with tragedy. Few memorials would remain of him, a statue in Armenia, thanking him for his help, and a cargo ship named after him, working around the Caspian Sea and the port of Astrakhan.